In a remote village, a strange noise puzzled the villagers. Days later, a polar bear arrived, crying out for help. The wind howled, doors and windows rattled, and anything not nailed down was blown over. A distant, distressed cry worried some villagers. Living in such an isolated place had led to terrifying folktales being passed down through generations. The villagers were brave and strong and had battled through some of the harshest living conditions, but the eerie cry was sending shivers down the spines of even the toughest men. Many rumors were flying around as to what could be the cause of the noise. No one could figure it out, though. Even those who had lived in the village the longest couldn't ever recall hearing anything like it. But when a young boy said he found some huge footprints in the snow, everyone laughed at the child's imagination and marveled at how he was trying to scare them. But the boy insisted he wasn't lying. He'd been on the outskirts of the village looking for fresh snow to make snow angels when he'd seen the footprints. He'd never seen anything like them before, so he decided to count how many he could see before they seemed to just disappear. It certainly sounded like a work of imagination, but the villagers wanted to make sure they weren't ignoring any threat, so they asked him to take them where he'd seen the footprints. There'd been no snowfall the day before, so if the boy was telling the truth, the prints should still be visible. Soon enough, they spotted a number of snow angels scattered around on the edge of the village and a little further along. Beside the small footprints of the boy were what looked like large paw prints. The villagers looked at each other in shock. Nothing living on the island could possibly leave prints that looked like this. The boy had been telling the truth, but now they had to find out what could have left the prints behind. The boy had been right. The prints just seemed to vanish, and without a trail, there was nothing to follow. That night, the villagers held a meeting. Word about the footprints had already spread, so it was decided the best course of action was to gather everyone together and nip any rumors in the bud. Between the footprints and the eerie noise, people were starting to get worried. The villagers were logical people, but finding a sensible explanation for both the noise and the footprints was hard. There was an uneasy feeling as the villagers left the meeting. Everyone was eager to be back inside the safety of their homes, and there wasn't a single person who didn't double-check their locks that night. The villagers were about to get a huge shock, though, as the source of the strange noise entered the village in the dead of night. The wind had settled down, and for a while the villagers couldn't hear the odd noise anymore. When hours had passed without a peep, they began to fall into a false sense of security. But the stillness of the night provided more clarity, and before long, the strange cry began once again, this time louder than ever. There was only one way to know for sure what was making the noise, and that was to go out and investigate. Believing there would be safety in numbers, the villagers quickly gathered together and began to follow the noise. Carrying torches and lanterns, they flooded the whole square with light, determined to put an end to all the unrest once and for all. They decided the best idea would be to head towards the spot where the footprints had been seen by the boy. But before they could even get anywhere near the outskirts of the village, they were all stopped in their tracks when they saw a large figure slowly ambling towards them. As the villagers craned their necks to see what was happening, whispers began to filter through the group. Those at the front of the crowd were saying that the creature looked like a bear, but that was impossible. There were no bears in this part of the world. Soon enough, the mysterious creature had gotten close enough to the village for the torches and lanterns to properly illuminate it. To everyone's shock, it was indeed a polar bear. The animal was letting out a sad, distressed cry. This was the sound that everyone had been hearing. How had a polar bear even gotten here? No such animals had ever roamed this land. It must have traveled hundreds of miles somehow. The creature was huge, but as it got closer, the villagers noticed its protruding ribs. This creature was famished. However, it wasn't moving towards them in a threatening way or with the typical stealth of a predator on the prowl. And when they looked closer, they understood why the animal was not just weakened by hunger and exhaustion. It was also injured. It seemed to have a wound on its side that was causing it pain. Hence the crying. When it reached a few feet from the villagers, the bear stopped and wearily laid down on the ground. Everyone began talking and speculating as to how the animal had even ended up entering the village. They lived on an island far away from the North Pole, and even if this bear was a travel enthusiast, it shouldn't have been able to walk or swim all this way with such a deep wound. What did it want? Why was it there? The villagers were uneasy. They all knew polar bears could be extremely dangerous, but this one seemed far too injured to attack. They all remembered hearing its heartbreaking cries for days, which meant it had gone quite some time without food or shelter. Its body was still quite sturdy and fleshy, but it simply lacked the strength to move. The older community members were considering whether the injured polar bear could help solve their low food supplies. They had never eaten bear meat before, but some thought that putting it out of its misery for a good cause was the right thing to do. However, the bear's sad cry made them reconsider, and they decided to try to help the distressed animal. They were compassionate and wouldn't hurt a bear that had come all this way to ask for help. But they were unsure how to approach the bear without getting injured and what would happen after it was healed. It was quickly decided that another village meeting was needed to discuss their options. So while a few people stood guard near the polar bear, everyone else headed to the town square to form a plan of action. The deliberations were lengthy, but in the end, the only reasonable explanation anyone could come up with was that the polar bear had drifted here on ice and sustained the injury on the unfamiliar landscape. The villagers knew how much the ice had broken and melted that summer, so it didn't seem too wild to assume that the polar bear could have been fishing when the ice broke, and the strong cold current could have easily caused it to drift hundreds of miles away from home. And now, injured, hungry, and scared, it was asking them for help. Being such a small community, the village didn't have anything like a vet. The closest thing they had was the small team that looked after the sled dogs. They often performed minor care on the dogs and had the equipment needed to anesthetize them should they need stitches or anything. Knocking out a sled dog was vastly different from a polar bear, though. Eventually, the team agreed that they would attempt to get close enough to the bear to administer the drugs and try to clean and bandage the wound. If this was successful, then the only option the villagers had was to contact the nearest town to see if they could help with transporting the bear home. Unbelievably, the polar bear was so weary and weak due to hunger and fatigue that the team managed to administer the drugs and clean the wound with ease. Being so close to such a magnificent creature was mind-blowing and an experience none of them would ever forget. It felt unreal that just a few nights ago, no one had known what the source of the odd noise was. No one could have ever imagined it was such an amazing animal crying for help. The villagers had banded together to do something unbelievable: save a polar bear. In the bear, the villagers saw their own struggles. They too had been deeply affected by the changing climate, the decrease in food, and the ever-changing landscape. All the same struggles that the bear had. The fact that it had ended up in their village was evidence of the way the world was changing for the worse. All they and the bear were trying to do was survive. And if the villagers could help the bear, then there was no question that they would. When the villagers contacted the nearest town, which still happened to be a few hundred miles away, no one believed what they were saying at first. There was no way a polar bear had drifted all that way. After some convincing, though, the mayor finally agreed to send a plane to airlift the bear back to its natural habitat. The offer came with conditions, though. The villagers would need to build a safe and secure crate to transport the bear and to anesthetize the beast for the journey. All of this would need to be done in less than a week. The winter weather was rolling in, and if they waited any longer, then the plane would be unable to make the journey. With some difficulty, the villagers had been able to move the bear to a storage shed while it was unconscious, which is where it was now recovering. They knew it was no place for such a beautiful animal, and getting it back to its home sooner rather than later was of the utmost importance. The food stores were tight as it was, and now they were having to share what little they had with the polar bear, which added an extra strain. No one could see the poor animal go hungry, though. They were in this together and would treat it as one of them. Then they set about building a large, secure crate ready for their polar bear's journey back home. They didn't have professional tools, but they were resourceful people and would make do with what little they had on hand. Just 5 days later, a plane landed on the outskirts of the remote village, ready to take the polar bear back home. One of the team members who had been taking care of the polar bear asked if he could go along and see the animal return to its natural habitat. Looking after the bear had been a huge privilege, and he wanted the satisfaction of seeing his job through. Once again, the bear was anesthetized and gotten ready for the journey back home. Moving such a large creature was no easy task, but thankfully, there were lots of people on hand to help get it into the crate. Now all anyone could do was pray that the crate was sturdy enough and that the dose of anesthesia had been strong enough to keep the bear asleep for the entire duration of the journey. The polar bear's journey was long, but the plane ride to its destination was swift and trouble-free. After landing, the crew promptly waited for the bear to wake up. In just 30 minutes, the bear slowly roused, recognized home, and set off across the snow, hopefully bringing an end to his adventures. That night, the villagers gathered together once more. The last few weeks had been quite unbelievable. They'd become used to just dealing with their own worries and problems, being so isolated from the world, but the arrival of the polar bear had shown them that they weren't the only ones feeling the tragic effects of the changing world. Its sudden appearance in the village had been terrifying yet awe-inspiring, and no one would ever forget the time when they all came together to help the animal return to its home. What an incredible story! If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. See you in the next video.